But and this is one of the issues that Jim and I talked about, as Jim Pizzari and I talked about a lot, which has to deal with how do you know that your technology works. And when you've got a device that is a prototype, you've only got one, and it's taken you perhaps $30,000 worth of hardware and $100,000 worth of man-hour to produce this device, how do you know that it's going to make a difference for a person or groups of people? And certainly trying to do large N type evaluations can be cost prohibitive. There's no way that you're going to do that with that device until you can get it down to a very inexpensive device that you can make available to a large number of people. So what do you do? And if you're dealing with something that is, say, you're going to be interested in whether or not it makes a difference in the life of a person with dementia, for example, you start to take into account things like the effects of learning. Like in other words, is this device supposedly going to be used to modify behavior in this individual? What really starts to become apparent is that you're really talking about doing single subject designs. That is, the work of B.F. Skinner and the like. Fits in pretty well. And one of the advantages about taking a single subject design, most likely like an ABA type design, is that you can get at whether or not you're changing behavior, and especially in cases where a person's got, say, hippocampal damage and they're not really able to consolidate memory. For you to be able to change the behavior at all, using a device that, say, prompts a person to engage in a behavior at a particular time every day, for it to work at all is something of a miracle, that a person will. And even if they do wind up learning as a result of it, you're talking about learning in a biologically damaged substrate where basically the person is not likely to learn anyway. So any modification in the behavior might be taken as being providing some evidence that, in effect, your technology, your very expensive technology, may be worth pursuing further and trying to get the cost down, as opposed to having it remain a kind of a one-off. So you can do studies of that nature with groups of as small as, say, 4 to 8 subjects. And get enough information as to whether or not the technology is worth pursuing. And if by some fortunate stroke of luck you find a way to mass produce the product, or you find that there may be some simpler variant of the device that you can use, which doesn't have quite the full set of features, but which gets at the 1 or 2 key features that actually did modify the behavior. So you wipe out, say, 90% of the development cost by sticking with just those 2 things that actually do work out of the 10 features that the device had initially. You can bring the cost down to the point where you can then run a study of, say, 30 or 50 people. We just continued, continuing with this line, we just finished a study, a 2-year study, which we published in the Journal of the American Medical Directors Association, where we followed 53 people over a period of a year. And what we did was we wound up using small RFID tags that people wore on their wrists. Now, the cost of the installation in the facility was about a $10,000 unit, but the individual tags were about $50 a piece. So we were able to follow. Well, we started out with 70, and we wound up with 53 after a year, and we collected on these 53 subjects about 43 million records on them, which included all of their movement variability data within a limited confined area inside the assisted living facility. So we had screen just went off. That's
Still done.
okay. But unless you needed a power adapter or not. Oh, okay. But such a device like this is the individual transponders that people were fairly inexpensive relative to the overall cost. And the cost of implementation in our case, while it was high, it allowed us to do 100 people at once. So a $10,000 device spread out over 100 people over a period of a year, actually, when you amortize it out, winds up being relatively inexpensive, given the fact that what we were trying to do was to look at movement pattern variability that might be predictive of a much more expensive event, namely a fall. And so when you start dealing with falls and, you're looking at the costs for litigation and for, broken hips and all the medical care that goes along with it, those are very expensive events. And for that, a $50 transponder that a person wears over a period of a year is relatively cheap, especially if it can serve as insurance for a person that this person is being watched more carefully, and in our case, can be identified potentially as a source of risk.
You do. I work with a fractal dimension.
Yes.
You can diagnose people with Alzheimer's, or at least identify it even better than MMSE.
Yeah.
Just by the movement pattern.
Yeah. That's what we found with our subjects. Matt? Oh. Yeah. Actually, yes. And the interesting thing about it is what we tried to do. We published a paper with Donna Algaze initially, where we looked at ultra-wideband RFID as a way to study wandering in people with dementia. And that was one of the first papers that we put out. Understand that wandering behavior, one of the principal components of wandering is that it's a random behavior. That is to say that, you're not really looking so much for a pattern in movement, although they do look for lapping and pacing and things that are cyclical. But the major underlying component is a random element to it. Now, human beings as observers are pretty much programmed to look for patterns. And it's what we do. The human visual system, auditory system, and the rest are really good at picking out patterns in data and their surroundings. What we don't do so well is pick out random. We sort of know when we see it, but we're not really good at it. So we wanted to have a means of quantifying the movement variability that people generate as part of their normal daily activities. And what we typically have done in the past when you're studying wandering is you take a graduate student, you give them a clipboard, and you put them in the assisted living facility, and you have them watch the people move around, and they tick off a box. Well, that's a lap, that's a pace, and so forth. The problem with that is that it's very reactive. You set a young person down in the midst of a group of older individuals, and the first thing they want to do is come over and show you photographs of their grandkids and engage you in conversation. And so you can't really fade into the background very well as an observer. And so the other thing is that you can't maintain your attention as an observer on more than one person at a time. It's really hard to do. People are not really good at vigilance tasks. We know that, and especially if you're trying to study the progression of wandering over a long period of time. So we want to resort to electronic devices in order to do this. So the